Hey there, welcome to Shadow Archives. I have some news for you. A while back, I asked where you'd prefer ads, and you know what? The response was clear. Most of you said no ads at all would be better. So I've made a decision. I've turned off monetization completely. From now on, it's ad-free, just like when I started this channel. If you do see any ads, that's YouTube placing them automatically, not me. From my side, no interruptions, just pure storytelling. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. And if you enjoy these stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's begin. In the spring of 2014, two young women from the Netherlands set out on what was supposed to be a life-changing adventure. They were in their early 20s, full of energy and curiosity, and excited to explore the world beyond Europe. Their names were Chris Kremers and Lisanne Froon. Like many travelers their age, they had saved money, planned carefully, and researched the places they wanted to see. South America felt vibrant and full of promise. Their destination was Panama, a country known for its rainforests, mountains, and welcoming communities. They arrived in early 2014 and spent time volunteering and exploring the region around Boquete, a small mountain town popular with backpackers. Boquete is known for its cool climate, coffee farms, and hiking trails. It feels peaceful, tucked into the highlands. It didn't seem like a dangerous place. The two young women reportedly researched the area before setting out. They were not reckless thrill seekers. They were careful, educated travelers. On April 1st, 2014, they decided to hike a well-known trail called the Pianista Trail. The trail begins gently and climbs into the mountains, eventually leading toward more remote jungle terrain. It was not considered extreme or highly dangerous, especially at the beginning. Many tourists walked at least part of it each year. They left with a small backpack, cameras, and at least one phone. It was meant to be a day hike. They did not plan to disappear. When they failed to return, concern grew quickly. Days passed with no contact. Search efforts began. Authorities and volunteers combed the jungle, calling their names. They hoping to find some sign that they had simply gotten lost and were waiting to be rescued. Weeks later, a breakthrough came. A local woman found a backpack near a riverbank. Inside were personal belongings, a camera, phones, sunglasses, and other items. The backpack appeared to be in relatively good condition, not heavily damaged by the elements. That detail alone sparked questions. How had it remained intact in a rainforest environment known for heavy rain and flooding? When investigators examined the phones, they discovered something unsettling. After the girls' last known daytime photos, pictures taken along the trail, there were attempts to call emergency numbers. In Panama, the emergency number is 911. Repeated attempts had been made over several days, thus suggesting that at least one of the women had been alive for some time after they went missing. At certain points, the phone was turned on but not unlocked successfully. Investigators later noted that incorrect PIN codes were entered multiple times. That detail led to speculation. Was someone else trying to access the phone? Or was one of the girls too weak or injured to enter the correct code? The data did not offer clear answers, only more uncertainty. Even more disturbing were the photographs taken at night. Dozens of images were captured in darkness. Many showed little more than black space, flashes of vegetation, or strange angles. Some appeared to show parts of the forest floor, rocks, or tree branches. A few images hinted at personal items placed on stones, possibly as markers or signals. It remains unclear whether these photos were attempts to use the flash as a light source, a signal for rescuers, or something else entirely. The timeline suggested that after the first emergency calls, There were days of silence, then occasional attempts to power on the phone. That pattern created a haunting picture. Two young women lost in dense jungle terrain, possibly injured trying to survive. Months later, human remains were discovered. One of the first pieces found was a foot still inside a boot. DNA testing confirmed it belonged to Lisanne Froon. The discovery of a severed foot shocked everyone following the case. It forced investigators to confront the grim reality that survival was unlikely. Over time, additional remains were located. Scattered bones were found in different areas of the forest. Some were described as having been bleached, raising further questions. In tropical climates, natural decomposition, river movement, sun exposure, and animal activity can all affect how remains appear. However, the condition of the bones fueled speculation and fear. For many people in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and across Europe, the case became deeply unsettling. It combined elements of mystery, isolation, and unanswered questions. Two young women vanished on what should have been a straightforward hike. Their belongings were found. Their phone records showed attempts to seek help. Their remains were scattered. There have been multiple theories over the years. One possibility is that they became lost beyond the maintained part of the trail and entered more dangerous jungle terrain. The region beyond the continental divide becomes far more rugged and less traveled. A wrong turn can lead into steep ravines, slippery rocks, and fast-moving rivers. Injuries in such terrain can quickly become life-threatening. Another theory suggests foul play. Some believe that someone may have encountered them after they ventured deeper into the forest. Supporters of this theory point to the unusual phone activity and the scattered nature of the remains. However, official investigations in Panama concluded that there was no clear evidence of homicide. The prevailing explanation remains that they likely became lost and succumbed to exposure, injury, or natural hazards. The jungle is unforgiving. Dense canopy blocks sunlight, trails can disappear quickly, rivers swell after rainfall, even experienced hikers can become disoriented. When you are injured or dehydrated, decision-making becomes harder. Panic can set in. The repeated emergency calls in the first days suggest that they understood they were in trouble. One of the most haunting aspects of the case is the night photographs. Some people believe they were taken as a way to create light in total darkness. Others think they might have been attempts to document their surroundings. Without context, the images remain eerie. They show fragments of a place that feels isolated and silent. The discovery of bones described as bleached also sparked intense online discussion. In tropical climates, bones can appear lighter after exposure to sun, water, and natural processes. Rivers can carry remains downstream and scatter them over time. Animals can disturb and relocate bones. While the word bleached sounds sinister, the environmental factors can produce similar effects. Despite years of speculation, no definitive evidence has emerged to confirm a criminal act. At the same time, the lack of a complete explanation leaves room for doubt in the minds of many. That uncertainty is what keeps the case alive in online discussions and true crime communities. For families and friends, however, the mystery is not entertainment. It is a permanent loss. Two daughters left home for an adventure and never returned. Their final days were likely filled with fear and confusion. The emergency call attempts suggest that they were trying desperately to survive. This case resonates strongly with travelers around the world. Many people have hiked unfamiliar trails or explored remote areas. The idea that a simple day hike can turn into a life and death situation is sobering. It reminds us how quickly nature can shift from beautiful to dangerous. It also highlights the importance of preparation, informing others of plans, carrying emergency supplies, understanding terrain, and recognizing limits. Even then, unpredictable events can occur. A slip on wet rock, a twisted ankle, a wrong turn. Small moments can change everything. The disappearance of Chris Creamers and Lisanne Froon remains one of the most unsettling travel mysteries of the past decade. Whether the truth lies in tragic misadventure or something more sinister, what stands out most is the human element. Two young women stepped onto a trail under blue skies, likely laughing and taking photos, unaware that it would be their last recorded day. For many people, the images of that backpack, the unanswered emergency calls, and the scattered bones create a sense of unease that lingers, not because of sensational details, but because of how ordinary the beginning of the story was. It started like countless other backpacking trips, and that is what makes it so haunting. I once had a close friend who went through something that he never really got over. Even now, years later, when I think about the way he described it, I can still hear the seriousness in his voice. He was not the type of person who enjoyed making things up for attention. If anything, he was usually quiet and skeptical about most things. But when he talked about his old house, there was no joking in his tone. He told me that living there had become difficult over time. At first, it was small things. Objects would fall in his room for no clear reason. A book might slide off a desk. Something light might tip over. He would assume he had placed it too close to the edge, or that he bumped into something earlier without realizing it. But after a while, it kept happening even when he was sure nothing was near the edge of a surface. He also described sudden temperature changes. He would be lying in bed and feel a cold patch of air move across him, even though the windows were closed. Other times, the room would feel strangely warm for no clear reason. He checked the vents more than once to see if the heating or air conditioning was acting up. But nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The worst part for him was the noises. At night, especially when everything was quiet, he would hear faint sounds that did not make sense. Sometimes it sounded like something dragging lightly across the floor. Other times it was a soft knock or a tapping sound against the wall. There were moments when he heard what sounded like something shifting in his closet. It made it hard for him to sleep. He would lie awake listening, trying to decide whether he was imagining it or not. He tried not to tell his parents at first because he did not want them to think he was being dramatic. But eventually, he found out that they were experiencing things too. In fact, they were dealing with even more intense disturbances. His parents heard doors slamming on their own, not just creaking, but forceful slams that echoed through the hallway. They would walk out of their bedroom expecting to see a window open or someone moving around, but everything would be still. Dishes in the kitchen would sometimes fall without anyone touching them. One plate shattered on the floor while the entire family was sitting in the living room. No one was anywhere near the cabinets. They also reported hearing footsteps, not random creaks from the house settling, but steady steps moving down the hallway late at night. The kind of sound that makes you think someone is walking toward your room. More than once his father got up to check, thinking someone had broken into the house. But every time the doors were locked and there was no sign of anyone. The tension in the house started to grow. It was not just fear, it was frustration. They tried to come up with logical explanations. Maybe the house was old and shifting. Maybe the plumbing caused strange noises. Maybe temperature changes were due to poor insulation. They even checked for animals in the walls, but nothing they investigated gave them a solid answer. Eventually, his parents decided they had enough. They contacted someone who specialized in investigating paranormal activity. My friend could not remember the exact title, but it was someone like a paranormal investigator or a spiritual medium. This person came to the house to examine the situation. The investigator walked through each room slowly, paying close attention to areas where activity seemed strongest. He asked detailed questions. When did the noises happen? Which rooms felt the coldest? Where had objects fallen most often? The family explained that most of the strange experiences centered around the connecting bedrooms. My friend's room shared a wall with his parents' room, and that part of the house seemed to be the focus. The investigator entered those rooms and paused. According to my friend, the man stood still for a few moments and then said he could feel something. He described it as a presence moving between the two rooms. He said the energy felt unsettled, almost restless. The way my friend repeated those words later made it clear that the moment left an impact on him. Now, whether someone believes in paranormal energy or not, the effect on the family was real. Hearing an outside person confirm that something felt wrong inside their home made everything more serious. It was no longer just unexplained noises. It felt like confirmation of something they could not see. Not long after that visit, the family made the decision to move out. They did not want to stay and continue experiencing fear every night. For them, peace of mind mattered more than trying to prove or disprove what was happening. Once they left, my friend said the strange experiences stopped completely. He never found out who moved into the house after them. Sometimes he wondered if the new owners experienced anything unusual. Other times, he preferred not to think about it. He told me that even years later, he still feels uneasy when he remembers lying in bed, listening to footsteps that should not have been there. I asked him once if he thought it could have been stress or imagination. He admitted that he had considered that possibility, but he always came back to one fact. His parents experienced the same things independently. They would mention a door slamming before he could bring it up. They would ask if he heard the footsteps before he said anything. That shared experience made it harder for him to dismiss it completely. Stories like his are difficult to categorize. Some people believe houses can hold energy from past events. Others believe every unexplained noise has a physical cause, even if it takes time to discover it. In places like the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada, there are countless similar stories. Families who hear doors slam, feel sudden cold spots, or sense something watching them in the dark. The human mind is powerful. Fear can amplify normal sounds. Old houses can shift and settle in ways that feel unnatural at night. But at the same time, shared experiences like the one my friend described are what keep these stories alive. What I remember most is not the idea of a ghost roaming between rooms. It is the effect it had on him, the lack of sleep, the tension in his voice, the way he described sitting in silence, waiting for the next sound. That kind of fear feels real, even if the cause remains unknown. Whether there was truly something in that house, or whether it was a combination of natural explanations and heightened awareness, I cannot say. I only know that the family left because they no longer felt comfortable there, and sometimes that alone says enough. My mother was born and raised in China, though her background was a mix of American and Italian roots. Her upbringing was complicated and international, shaped by different cultures and shifting political climates. By the time she was in her late teens, somewhere between 16 and 19, she was already living a life that most people wouldn't experience in a lifetime. She was connected in some way to a foreign embassy at the time, either American or Portuguese. The exact details have blurred over the years, but what I do remember clearly is the black embassy license plate on her car. Back then, that plate carried weight. It meant diplomatic protection. It meant certain privileges. It meant, in many situations, you were not treated like an ordinary citizen. In 1980s China, that mattered a lot. Foreigners were not always welcome. Regulations were strict. The government kept a close eye on outsiders. The political atmosphere was tense and complicated. It wasn't impossible for foreigners to live and work there, But it wasn't simple either. There were rules layered on top of rules, and enforcement could be unpredictable. My mother was not the type to live quietly within boundaries. She was adventurous, fearless to the point of recklessness at times. She moved in interesting circles, met people from different industries, and briefly had connections to the film world. She once mentioned meeting a young Christian Bale when he was still just starting out. That was the kind of life she led, unexpected and fast-moving. She thrived on intensity, but during this particular period, her life was not glamorous. It was painful. Her father had recently died of cancer. Losing him devastated her. She had already lost her mother a few years earlier, so by her late teens, she had endured more grief than many people face in decades. She was trying to arrange for her father's cremated remains to be buried properly. Either she was attempting to gain access to a cemetery to bury him, or she was trying to move his remains to a different burial site. That detail is fuzzy in my memory. What stands out clearly is that the government was blocking her. Some bureaucratic rule, one of many strict regulations regarding foreigners and burial rights, was standing in her way. Whether it was because of his citizenship status, the cemetery's policies, or some larger political guideline, she was being denied something deeply personal and important. In her mind, it felt heartless and unnecessary. Grief mixed with anger. This was also shortly after the events of the Tiananmen Square protests and massacre in 1989. The country was on edge. Beijing was under heavy military presence. The square itself was essentially locked down. Civilians were not supposed to enter. The atmosphere in the city was tense and watchful. Soldiers stood guard. Checkpoints were common. A few days after the crackdown, my mother was out driving with friends. I don't remember exactly where they were headed. What I do remember is what happened when they approached the area near Tiananmen Square. Something in her snapped. She was already furious with the government over how they had handled her father's burial. She felt powerless, grieving, and angry. And in that moment, when they were near the military blockade, she made a decision that still feels surreal to think about. She said, "Essentially, forget this, we're driving through." And she hit the gas. The car surged forward toward a space that was not meant to be crossed. Soldiers were stationed there, armed with rifles. This wasn't a minor traffic violation. This was a direct challenge to a military lockdown in one of the most politically sensitive places in the country. As she told the story later, the sound is what stuck with her most. The windows were open. As the car accelerated, you could hear the unmistakable metallic clicks and clacks of dozens of rifles being readied. She described it as a chorus of weapons being prepared all at once. The soldiers raised their guns. From her account, it felt like 50 or more were aimed at the vehicle in an instant. Her friends panicked. They ducked down in their seats, screaming that she had lost her mind and that they were all about to die. In most circumstances, they probably would have, but the black embassy plate changed everything. Shooting at a civilian car would have been serious enough. Shooting at a vehicle with diplomatic plates could have sparked an international crisis. The soldiers hesitated. That hesitation made all the difference. She drove straight through the square. No one fired. Once past the most heavily guarded area, she turned onto one of Beijing's ring roads. The city is organized in circular highways that wrap around the center. I don't remember if it was the 4th ring road or the 5th. She sped away, adrenaline pumping, heart racing. When she told the story years later, she didn't frame it as heroic. It wasn't political activism. It wasn't calculated protest. It was anger and defiance colliding with grief. It was a young woman who had already lost both parents and felt that the government was blocking her final chance to honor her father properly. Looking back as an adult, I understand how reckless it was. In 1989, Beijing was not a place where you challenged armed soldiers lightly. The tension after Tiananmen was real and raw. The fact that they held their fire was likely due entirely to the diplomatic status implied by that black plate. What would have happened if they had stopped her instead of letting her pass? It's impossible to say. At best, she might have been detained and interrogated. At worst, it could have escalated into something far more dangerous. The political climate at the time did not favor leniency. Not long after that period, she had to leave China. She was working in journalism, and that brought its own risks. Governments with tight control over information do not appreciate journalists who expose uncomfortable truths. Whether it was her reporting or simply her growing visibility, she found herself needing to get out before things became more complicated. The 1980s and early 1990s in China were not simple years. For someone like her, foreign-connected, outspoken, grieving, and adventurous, it was a volatile environment. When she tells the story now, there's a strange mix of humor and seriousness in her voice. She laughs about how reckless she was. She jokes about how her friends thought they were all going to die. But underneath that, there's an understanding of how close it may have come to disaster. For audiences in the United States, the United Kingdom, or Canada, it's hard to imagine driving through an active military blockade in a politically sensitive square and surviving because of a license plate. It feels like a scene from a film. But that was her reality. What stays with me most is not the thrill of it, it's the emotion behind it. A young woman who had already buried her mother, a father's ashes she was fighting to honor, a system that felt cold and unyielding, and a moment of fury that could have ended very differently. My mother has always been bold, sometimes too bold. But that moment captures who she was at that age, grieving, angry, fearless, and unwilling to be told no. It's a story that sounds unbelievable until you remember the context. A city under military control, a diplomatic plate offering fragile protection, and a young woman who had already lost so much that she stopped being afraid. Every time she tells it, I can't help but think about how thin the line was between survival and tragedy, and how sometimes history brushes right past ordinary people in ways that leave permanent marks. When I was a kid, my family attended a church and school in Missouri that felt like the center of our world. It was not just a place for Sunday services. It was where we went to school during the week, where we saw the same families over and over again, where potlucks and holiday programs brought everyone together. The pastor was not just a religious leader. He was someone people trusted deeply. His family was visible in the church all the time. His wife helped with events. His daughter attended activities. They seemed like a model family, the kind that people pointed to as an example. At that age, I did not think much about the private lives of adults. To me, church felt structured and predictable. There were clear rules, clear teachings, and clear expectations. It was a very conservative environment. The idea that the man was the head of the household was taught openly and regularly. Authority and obedience were emphasized. Questioning leadership or doctrine was not encouraged. Years after we left that church, my mom sat me down one day and told me something that completely changed how I viewed those memories. She told me that the pastor's wife and daughter had died. It was not an accident. According to what she explained, the wife had shot her daughter and then turned the gun on herself. Both of them died. I remember feeling stunned. The image of that family, standing together at the front of the church, did not match what I was hearing. It felt impossible that something so violent could happen in a family that everyone saw as deeply religious and stable. My mom told me this about 10 years after it happened. She said she had not wanted to tell me earlier because I was too young to understand. But what made it even more disturbing were the rumors that followed. According to some people who had stayed connected to the church, there was suspicion that the situation might not have been as simple as it seemed. There were whispers that the daughter had been questioning her faith. She had been asking difficult questions about religion, about belief, about whether she wanted to continue living within that strict system. In a more open community, that might have been seen as normal. Teenagers question things, they explore ideas, they think critically about what they have been taught. But in a very conservative environment where obedience and submission are central values, questioning can be seen as rebellion. It can be seen as spiritual failure. My mom said that some people believed the pastor may have encouraged his wife to handle the situation, not necessarily in a direct, obvious way, but through pressure, through intense belief, through the idea that leaving the faith would be worse than death. There was no public proof of that. No charges, no official findings that confirmed such a claim. It remained speculation. But the fact that people even suspected it says something about the atmosphere inside that community. When you grow up in a setting where authority is rarely challenged, where the father is seen as the unquestioned leader of the home, the balance of power can become deeply uneven. If a family is struggling privately, outsiders may never see it. They only see the polished version presented on Sundays. As I got older, I began thinking about how much pressure can build inside environments like that. When faith becomes tied to identity, family reputation, and eternal consequences, doubt can feel dangerous. A young person asking questions might not just be seen as curious. They might be seen as threatening the spiritual stability of the entire household. I also thought about the wife. What was she experiencing? Was she struggling silently with her own fears? Was she under emotional pressure? Was she battling mental illness that no one recognized or took seriously? In many conservative communities, mental health is not always openly discussed. Problems are sometimes framed as spiritual weakness instead of psychological distress. The tragedy itself is heartbreaking regardless of the cause. A mother killing her child and then herself is something that leaves permanent damage in the lives of everyone connected to them. It raises painful questions about what was happening behind closed doors. The rumor that the pastor may have encouraged it makes the story even darker, but it is important to approach that carefully. Rumors grow easily after tragedy. People try to make sense of something that feels senseless. Sometimes suspicion reflects deeper distrust within a community. Sometimes it reflects patterns people have noticed, but could not prove. Looking back, I think about the daughter the most. If she truly was questioning her faith, that is something many young people go through. In places like the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada, conversations about religion have become more open over time. Questioning belief is often seen as part of personal growth, but in some communities, especially highly conservative ones, doubt can feel like betrayal. It makes me wonder what kind of conversations were happening inside that house. Was she expressing fear? Was she asking honest questions? Was she being told that leaving the faith would bring shame? We will probably never know the full truth. What I do know is that tragedies like this expose the complexity of faith, authority, and family dynamics. They show how dangerous it can be when control overrides compassion. They also remind us how important it is to create spaces where people can ask questions without fear of rejection or punishment. When my mom told me the story, it shifted something in me. It made me realize that even communities that look strong and united on the outside can hide deep struggles inside. It made me more aware of how power works in religious settings, and it made me think about the responsibility leaders have when people trust them completely. The memory of that church now feels different. The hymns, the sermons, the lessons about obedience, they carry a heavier weight. Not because faith itself is harmful, but because any system that discourages questioning can create pressure that builds quietly over time. In the end, what happened remains a tragedy no matter the cause. A mother and daughter lost their lives. A family was destroyed. A community was shaken. Whether rumors about encouragement were true or not, the fact that people believed it was possible speaks volumes about the environment. It is a reminder that faith should never silence honest doubt, that leadership should never mean control, and that when young people ask questions, the response should be understanding, not fear. Even years later, the story stays with me, not just because of the violence, but because of what it suggests about how fragile things can become when authority, belief, and pressure collide. During the Second World War, while most people think about the fighting in Europe or the Pacific Islands, another dark chapter was unfolding in occupied China. In the region of Manchuria, which had been taken over by Japan in the 1930s, the Japanese military established a secret research complex that would later become known as Unit 731. Officially, it was described as something harmless, even ordinary. At one point, it was presented as a lumber mill. The cover story made it seem like just another industrial operation in a time of war. In reality, it was one of the most brutal human experimentation centers in modern history. The facility was large and heavily guarded. It included laboratories, prison cells, operating rooms, and cremation furnaces. Prisoners were transported there under tight security. Many of them were Chinese civilians. Others included Koreans, Mongolians, and a small number of Soviet prisoners. They were not treated as people. Inside the compound, they were referred to as marutas, which means logs in Japanese. The word was chosen deliberately. It stripped away identity and humanity. It made it easier for those involved to treat the victims as materials rather than living human beings. The doctors and scientists who worked there were not uneducated or poorly trained. In fact, many of them were respected professionals from across Japan. Some were graduates of top universities. They had studied medicine, biology, and microbiology. In another setting, they might have been known for healing or research that improved lives. At Unit 731, however, their skills were used for the opposite purpose. The experiments conducted there were carried out without anesthesia. The justification given at the time was that painkillers might interfere with results. That reasoning allowed unimaginable suffering to become routine. Prisoners were deliberately infected with diseases, so doctors could observe how those illnesses progressed in the human body. Others were subjected to surgical procedures while still alive and conscious. One of the most horrifying practices was vivisection, which is the dissection of a living person. Prisoners were opened up so doctors could examine internal organs in real time. They wanted to study how diseases damaged tissues and how the body responded to trauma. There was no intention of saving the patient. The goal was only observation and data collection. After the procedure, the victims were killed and their bodies disposed of in the crematorium. Women were not spared from cruelty. Some were assaulted and deliberately infected with sexually transmitted diseases to study how infections spread and how they affected pregnancy. In certain cases, pregnant women were experimented on to observe fetal development under extreme conditions. The lack of basic human compassion inside the facility is difficult to fully grasp. Mothers and unborn children were treated as test subjects rather than as lives. Other prisoners were used in weapons testing. They were tied to posts and placed at various distances from explosive devices so researchers could examine the effects of blasts and shrapnel on the human body. Some were shot at close range to compare wound patterns. Others were stabbed with bayonets for similar study. Limbs were deliberately frozen in harsh winter temperatures until frostbite set in. Doctors then observed how tissues died and sometimes refroze and shattered limbs to study long-term damage. Prisoners were denied food and water, so researchers could record how long a person could survive under starvation or dehydration. Some were exposed to extreme heat or subjected to high-speed spinning in centrifuges to test physical endurance. As horrific as those experiments were, the central mission of Unit 731 focused on biological warfare. The Japanese military wanted to develop powerful strains of deadly diseases that could be used as weapons. Researchers worked with pathogens such as anthrax, typhoid, cholera, tuberculosis, and bubonic plague. They studied how to grow these diseases in large quantities and how to spread them effectively. Prisoners were intentionally infected with these illnesses. Doctors observed symptoms carefully, noting fever progression, organ failure, and eventual death. Blood samples were taken, and in some cases, pathogens were extracted and cultivated for further use. The goal was not only to understand disease, but to weaponize it. One of the most chilling strategies involved infecting fleas with plague bacteria. The fleas were then sealed in clay containers and dropped over villages in occupied regions of China. When the containers broke open, the infected fleas spread disease among local populations. Entire communities suffered outbreaks. Thousands of civilians died as a result. These were not isolated incidents, but deliberate acts designed to test biological warfare in real-world conditions. Inside the facility, no prisoner was expected to leave alive. Once someone entered Unit 731, survival was not part of the plan. At the end of the war, as Japan faced defeat, efforts were made to destroy evidence. Documents were burned, buildings were demolished. Remaining prisoners were killed to eliminate witnesses. The goal was to erase proof of what had taken place. After Japan surrendered in 1945, the world began uncovering the extent of wartime atrocities across many countries. The crimes of Nazi Germany became widely known through the Nuremberg trials. What is less commonly discussed is how the members of Unit 731 were handled. Instead of facing trials similar to those in Europe, many of the leading figures were granted immunity by the United States. The reason was strategic. American officials were interested in the data collected by Unit 731. With tensions rising between the United States and the Soviet Union, the beginning of the Cold War was already taking shape. U.S. military leaders believed that the research from Unit 731 could provide valuable information about biological weapons. They also wanted to prevent that knowledge from falling into Soviet hands. In exchange for handing over their research findings, many of the scientists and doctors involved were protected from prosecution. They returned to civilian life. Some resumed careers in medicine and academia. Others held respected positions in society. Unlike the widely publicized trials of Nazi war criminals, the story of Unit 731 remained relatively hidden for decades. For survivors and families of victims, this outcome added another layer of pain. Not only had loved ones suffered unimaginable cruelty, but those responsible were largely spared legal consequences. In later years, survivors came forward with testimony. Historians and journalists investigated. Memorials were eventually created in China to honor the victims. Yet for a long time, the full story was not widely known in the West. The events at Unit 731 force us to confront uncomfortable truths about war, science, and morality. They show how easily scientific knowledge can be twisted when ethical boundaries are removed. They also demonstrate how political interests can sometimes override justice. For audiences in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada, learning about Unit 731 can be shocking because it is not always emphasized in standard history lessons. Yet it is a critical part of understanding the global scale of suffering during the Second World War. It reminds us that atrocities were not limited to one region or one ideology. They occurred wherever power was unchecked and human life was devalued. Today, historians continue to study archival records and survivor accounts to piece together the full scope of what happened in Manchuria. Museums and documentaries aim to ensure that the victims are remembered not as statistics or logs, but as individuals with names, families, and stories. Remembering Unit 731 is not about dwelling on horror for its own sake. It is about recognizing how far humanity can fall when cruelty is justified in the name of progress or national interest. It is about understanding the importance of medical ethics, international law, and accountability. The story also raises difficult questions about justice after war. When governments choose strategic advantage over prosecution, what message does that send? How do societies reconcile with the knowledge that some perpetrators lived ordinary lives after committing extraordinary crimes? There are no simple answers. What remains clear is that the victims of Unit 731 endured suffering that should never be forgotten. Their experiences serve as a warning about the dangers of dehumanization and the misuse of science. More than 70 years later, the memory of that facility in Manchuria still stands as a stark reminder of the darkest possibilities of human behavior. And remembering it is one small way to honor those who never had the chance to leave alive. A few years ago, I was working on a renovation project in an old farmhouse that dated back to the late 1800s. It sat alone on a stretch of land that felt like it hadn't changed much in over a century. The paint was peeling, the porch sagged slightly at one end, and the windows had that wavy look old glass gets with age. You could almost feel the weight of time pressing down on the place. Houses like that carry stories in their walls, whether anyone remembers them or not. The interior had the kind of layout you'd expect from that era. A narrow staircase led up from the living room. The kitchen was small but solidly built, with thick wooden cabinets and wide plank floors that creaked with every step. The living room connected openly to the kitchen, separated only by a wide doorway without a door. Even during the day, the house felt dim because the trees outside blocked much of the sunlight. Dust hung in the air whenever we disturbed old boards or insulation. It had been a long day of work. My co-worker and I were finishing up around dusk, the kind of tired where your shoulders ache and your mind is already halfway home. We were cleaning tools, stacking supplies, and getting ready to lock up. His phone was sitting on the kitchen countertop near the edge, but not dangerously so. It had been there for hours. We both had seen it multiple times throughout the day. The house was quiet in that heavy way old houses can be. Not silent exactly, but filled with small settling sounds. Wood expanding and contracting. Faint pops in the walls, the occasional rustle from outside. None of that felt unusual. We'd been there long enough that those noises had become background. I was standing in the doorway between the kitchen and living room when it happened. My co-worker was a few feet behind me, grabbing his jacket. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement from the counter. At first, I assumed he had reached for his phone without me noticing, but when I turned fully, I saw something that didn't make sense. The phone lifted. It didn't slide. It didn't tip. It rose off the countertop. I remember thinking there must be some explanation, that maybe it had been closer to the edge and was falling. But it wasn't falling. It was suspended, several inches above the counter, moving horizontally into the living room. It traveled smoothly, not tumbling end over end like a dropped object. It moved level, as if held in someone's hand. My coworker froze. I could see in his face that he was seeing the same thing I was. The phone continued across the open space, about 5 feet into the living room. It didn't wobble, it didn't drop. It looked exactly like someone walking while holding it at chest height, except there was no one there. We both stood completely still. Neither of us spoke. The air felt thick, like the room had suddenly shrunk around us. Then, just as suddenly, the phone jerked forward. The movement changed from steady to sharp. It accelerated in a way that looked deliberate, like someone had drawn their arm back and thrown it. It flew forward and hit the far wall with a loud crack before dropping to the floor. The sound snapped us out of whatever frozen state we were in. We looked at each other in disbelief. I remember saying something like, "Did you just see that?" Which felt ridiculous because obviously he had. His face had gone pale. There was no joking, no immediate attempt to laugh it off. We both knew what we had seen. He slowly walked over and picked up his phone. The case had a small crack in it from where it hit the wall. The screen, somehow, was still intact. He turned it over in his hands like it might offer an explanation. We tried to rationalize it immediately. Maybe it had been knocked by something. Maybe there was a slope on the counter. But even as we said those things out loud, we both knew they didn't fit. Phones don't float. They don't glide through the air steadily for several feet. They don't change direction mid-air and accelerate like that without some force behind them. There were no wires attached, no shelves above it, no strong draft. The windows were closed. The house had been still all evening. The silence after the crash felt heavier than before. We both became very aware of how alone we were. The farmhouse was empty. We were the only 2 people inside. We had checked every room earlier in the day. No one else had keys. The property was isolated, far from neighbors. We gathered our things faster than usual. Neither of us wanted to stay any longer than necessary. As we moved toward the front door, we kept talking about what had just happened, trying to dissect it in real time. "Maybe it vibrated off the counter," he suggested. "It didn't fall," I replied. "It floated." Saying that word out loud made it feel even stranger. We reached the doorway and stepped onto the old wooden porch. The evening air felt cooler than before, though that might have just been the adrenaline wearing off. As I pulled the door shut behind us, that's when we heard it. Voices. They were coming from upstairs. Not loud shouting, not one clear voice. It sounded like a small group of people talking over each other in low conversation. The kind of murmur you'd hear at a family gathering when several people are chatting in the same room. We both froze again. The staircase inside led directly up from the living room to a narrow hallway and 2 bedrooms. We had been up there earlier that afternoon installing trim. No one had been there. No one could have entered without us seeing them. The voices didn't form clear words. It was more like the rhythm of speech. Rising and falling tones, pauses, the sound of multiple people present. It lasted maybe 10 seconds. Long enough for us to look at each other and confirm we were both hearing it. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. He nodded slowly. The realization that we had locked the house earlier in the day didn't matter. If someone had been inside, we would have seen them. There was only one staircase, no back exit from the upstairs. The windows were too small to climb through. The talking stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Not fading, not trailing off, just gone. The silence afterward felt unnatural, the kind that makes your ears ring because they're straining for something more. We didn't go back inside to check. That's something I still think about. In theory, we could have reopened the door, walked upstairs, and looked around, but neither of us suggested it. The instinct was to leave. We walked to our trucks without speaking much. The gravel crunched under our boots, loud in the quiet countryside. The farmhouse stood behind us, dark against the fading sky. From the outside, it looked completely normal, just an old building waiting for renovation. On the drive home, I replayed everything in my head. I tried to find a physical explanation for the phone. Maybe there had been a tremor. Maybe something structural had shifted and launched it. But none of that accounted for the smooth horizontal movement. None of it explained the acceleration. The voices were harder to dismiss. Old houses carry sound strangely. Wind can travel through gaps in ways that mimic speech. Pipes can echo. Animals in the attic can create surprising noises. But this hadn't been scratching or banging. It had been conversation, multiple tones overlapping in a way that felt human. In the days that followed, we returned to the house. Work still needed to be done. We didn't mention the incident to the property owner. It felt too unbelievable. Instead, we went back to sanding floors and replacing fixtures. Nothing else like that happened again. But the atmosphere felt different after that evening. Every creak carried more weight. Every shadow seemed deeper. We were more aware of being observed, even if that awareness came only from our own minds. I've worked in plenty of old homes since then. Farmhouses, Victorians, abandoned barns. They all have character. They all have quirks. But I have never seen an object move like that again. To this day, I can't explain it. I don't jump to conclusions. I don't claim to know what it was. Maybe there is some rare physical phenomenon that could cause a phone to lift and travel across a room. Maybe there's a detail we missed in the shock of the moment. But what stays with me isn't just the phone. It's the shared look between us. The fact that we both saw it. The fact that we both heard the voices upstairs at the same time. That farmhouse has probably stood for well over a century. Families lived there. Children grew up there. Arguments happened in those rooms. Laughter too. Houses absorb life over time. Whether that means anything beyond memory, I don't know. All I know is that one evening, in the quiet of an old kitchen, we watched a phone lift into the air as if carried by unseen hands. And as we stepped outside, something upstairs sounded very much like it was still talking. In the mid-1990s, my parents decided to take a vacation to Mexico. Back then, quick trips across the border were common for people living in Southern California. It was normal to drive down for a few days, enjoy the beaches, eat good food, shop in small markets, and then head back home. For them, it was supposed to be a relaxing getaway. They had both been working hard, and the idea of sunshine and a change of scenery sounded perfect. They did not take us kids with them on that particular trip. It was just the two of them. They packed the car, crossed the border without much trouble, and spent several days exploring coastal towns. When they talked about the first half of the trip, it always sounded pleasant. They mentioned street vendors selling fresh fruit, music playing from open windows, and warm evenings where everything felt slower and calmer than home. But when they came back, something had clearly changed. I remember they were unusually quiet after returning. They were not angry exactly, but there was tension in the air. They kept saying the same thing over and over. They would never go back, and they were firm about it. They told us that we should never go either. At the time, I was too young to understand why they felt so strongly. It seemed dramatic. Lots of people went to Mexico all the time. Why was their trip so different? It was not until years later that they explained what happened on the drive home. When you live in Southern California and travel to Mexico by car, you eventually have to cross back through a land border checkpoint. Anyone who has done that knows the lines can be long. On busy weekends, the wait can stretch for hours. Cars inch forward slowly under the hot sun. Drivers roll down their windows. People get restless. You watch the vehicles ahead of you, waiting for your turn to speak to a border officer. My parents expected some delay, but this time the line was much longer than usual. It was barely moving. Cars were being pulled aside more frequently. Officers were walking between vehicles, looking closely inside. Something was clearly different. At first, my parents assumed it was a routine increase in security. Maybe there had been a tip about drug smuggling. Maybe it was just random inspections. But as the minutes turned into hours, they started noticing a pattern. Border agents were paying particular attention to cars with children in the back seats. Not just children, but sleeping children. But they were shining flashlights inside. They were asking parents to wake their kids up. In some cases, they were opening doors and physically checking to make sure the children were responsive. My parents did not have kids in the car with them, so they were mostly watching from a distance. At some point, an officer made an announcement to several drivers in the area. Word began to spread slowly through the line. Apparently, someone had attempted to smuggle drugs across the border in a way that shocked everyone involved. The story, as it was told to my parents at the time, was that a child had been killed. The body had been filled or packed with drugs and then placed in the back seat of a car. The smugglers had tried to pass the child off as sleeping, they hoping that border officials would not disturb a sleeping kid and would simply wave the car through. The details were horrifying. Even just hearing about it secondhand was enough to make people in the line feel sick. The idea that someone would use a child's body in that way was beyond cruel. It felt almost unreal. Whether every detail of the story was accurate or whether some parts had grown through rumor is impossible to know now. But at that moment, the fear was very real. Border officers were not taking any chances. Every sleeping child in a vehicle was being woken up. Parents were being asked to confirm their identities. Some cars were searched thoroughly. My parents said the mood in the line changed immediately after they heard what had happened. Before that, it had just been frustration about waiting. Afterward, there was silence. People were looking at their own children differently. Even strangers were making eye contact with each other in disbelief. For my parents, the most disturbing part was not just the crime itself, but what it represented. It showed how far some criminal organizations were willing to go. It also shattered the sense of normalcy they had felt during their vacation. Just hours earlier, they had been enjoying beach views and warm weather. Now they were sitting in traffic thinking about something deeply unsettling. When they finally reached the checkpoint, the officers asked them several questions. Even though they did not have children with them, the agents were serious and focused. My parents said the tension in the air was heavy. Everyone knew why the extra checks were happening. The drive home after crossing the border felt different too. They were quiet most of the way. What should have been simple relief at being back in the United States was mixed with shock. It is one thing to hear about crime in the news. It is another to sit in a line of cars because of something that happened just hours before. When they told us later that they would never go back, it was not because they thought Mexico as a whole was dangerous. It was because that experience had left a mark on them. It changed how they viewed border crossings and drug trafficking. It made them realize how serious and dark those realities could be. As kids, we did not fully understand. Mexico was just a place on a map to us, a vacation destination. But to them, it had become connected to that long line at the border and the disturbing story they heard. Years later, when I was older, I asked them again about it. I wanted to know if they were sure the story was true. They admitted that some of what they heard might have been rumor mixed with fact. Border situations can create fast-moving stories that grow as they pass from one person to another. But they were certain about one thing. Officers were specifically stopping cars with sleeping children, and something serious had happened to cause that level of inspection. Even if some details were unclear, the fear was not imagined. The checkpoint was operating at a heightened level. Families were being asked to wake up kids who were simply tired from the drive. That alone tells you something out of the ordinary was going on. for people living in border states like California, Texas, or Arizona, these crossings are part of everyday life. Most trips are uneventful. Millions of people cross safely each year for work, family visits, or vacations. But stories like this highlight the darker side of cross-border crime and drug smuggling that law enforcement deals with regularly. Drug trafficking has long been a serious issue in North America. Smugglers have used many methods over the years, some creative and some deeply disturbing. Law enforcement agencies have to balance being respectful to families while also being alert to unusual situations. That day in the mid-1990s, they chose to inspect carefully, even if it meant longer waits and uncomfortable questions. For my parents, that borderline became a turning point. It was no longer just a travel memory, it was something they carried with them. The image of officers waking sleeping children stayed in their minds. To this day, whenever the topic of Mexico comes up, they still mention that trip. Not the beaches or the food, not the souvenirs. They mention the borderline. They mention the story they heard. And they repeat the same advice. Be careful, know where you are going, and understand that not everything you see on vacation reflects the full picture of what is happening behind the scenes. The world can be beautiful and troubling at the same time. That drive back to Southern California showed them both sides in a single day. And even though decades have passed, the memory of that long, tense line at the border is the part of the trip they never forgot. In the summer of 2009, I was deployed to Nowzad, Afghanistan. If you know anything about that place, you know it had a reputation. By the time I got there, most of the civilian population had fled. Years of fighting had turned what was once a functioning town into a maze of abandoned mud structures, shattered doorways, and empty streets. It felt like a city frozen mid-breath, then left to dry under a brutal sun. We were operating alongside the United States Marine Corps, pushing hard, clearing sectors, holding ground, and maintaining a constant presence. The forward observation base sat in the middle of what used to be a living community. Houses stood close together, stacked in uneven rows, made of compacted mud with wooden beams running through them. Balconies leaned slightly, doors hung open. The windows were empty holes cut into thick walls. The rules of engagement were clear and strict. If it wasn't wearing desert digital camouflage and it was moving inside the cleared perimeter, it was considered hostile. The area around the FOB had been swept repeatedly. Patrols moved through daily. The understanding was simple. There shouldn't be anyone there who wasn't supposed to be there. That night, I was sitting on the back of a 7-ton flatbed truck parked near a mortar pit. It was one of those rare Afghan nights where the sky opens up completely. With no city lights and almost no artificial glow, the stars were overwhelming. They felt close enough to touch. The air cooled slightly after sunset, but the ground still radiated heat from the day. I had an NVG monocular up to my eye, scanning lazily across the town. But night vision changes how you see the world. It flattens things, it highlights contrast. Mud walls glow pale, shadows turn thick and heavy. Anything darker than its surroundings stands out sharply. I remember focusing on a particular building across the way. It had a mud balcony with a timber support post running vertically near the center. The structure was partially collapsed, but that beam stood upright, dark against the lighter mud walls. As I stared at it, something felt off. The post moved. At first, my brain tried to correct what my eye was seeing. Maybe it was a shift in perspective. Maybe I adjusted slightly without realizing it. But the movement was deliberate. The dark vertical shape slid slowly toward the doorway behind it. I zoomed in slightly, bringing the image into sharper focus. That's when the shape changed in my mind. It wasn't a timber post. It was shaped like a person. With night vision, people usually show up as silhouettes against the lighter background of mud buildings. You can see a faint outline, sometimes the faint glow of clothing reflecting light differently. But this was different. This wasn't a silhouette. It was a black void. It looked like a human-shaped absence, a cutout of darkness darker than the surrounding shadows. It moved slowly at first, almost gliding, then suddenly bolted into the doorway of the house, with speed that didn't feel natural. It wasn't a normal run. It was abrupt, sharp, and fast enough to make my stomach tighten. I lowered the NVGs and blinked a few times, rubbing my eyes. Night vision can mess with depth perception. It can create illusions if you stare too long. I brought the monocular back up. See, the balcony was empty. I kept the lens fixed on that doorway, telling myself it had to be a trick of light. Then I saw it again. A head-shaped darkness leaned out from the doorway. Just the upper portion. It didn't have detail, no features, just the shape of a human head, darker than the interior behind it. It remained there for 5 to 10 seconds, long enough for me to process what I was looking at, long enough for the silence to feel heavy. Then it snapped back inside with the same quick, unnatural motion as before. My pulse had picked up. I scanned the surrounding area, expecting to see more movement. Nothing. The town remained still. The abandoned buildings stood quiet under the stars. Now Zad was known for strange things, not supernatural stories necessarily, but the psychological strain of operating in a ghost town warps your senses. You're trained to look for threats. You're trained to assume movement means danger, but you're also exhausted, hyper-alert, and aware that insurgents had used abandoned homes before. I kept watching that balcony on and off for the rest of my shift. It never showed itself again. I didn't immediately say anything dramatic. I mentioned to a couple of guys that I thought I saw movement in one of the houses. We logged it mentally. That's what you do. You catalog, you stay alert, you move on. Apparently, I wasn't the only one. Not long after that night, a tower gunner manning an MK-19 saw something similar in that same structure. The MK-19 is not subtle. It's an automatic 40mm grenade launcher mounted high with a wide field of fire. When it engages, it doesn't ask questions. The gunner reported seeing movement in the house and engaged the target. The building didn't stand a chance. The mud walls erupted under explosive rounds. The balcony collapsed. The doorway disappeared in a cloud of dust and debris. After that, whatever had been in there, if anything had been, was gone. We never saw that shape again. Afghanistan has a way of bending perception. Long hours of watch under night vision. The knowledge that enemies blend into the landscape. The fact that entire towns can be emptied and left standing like hollow shells. It messes with you. I've asked myself many times what I saw. Could it have been a person? Possibly. Despite patrols and clearing operations, the reality is that insurgents sometimes slipped through. Mud houses are full of hidden compartments and crawl spaces. It's not impossible someone was sheltering there, but the speed, the way it moved, the complete absence of reflective detail, it didn't look like someone wearing dark clothing. It looked like something absorbing light. Night vision amplifies available light, turning faint illumination into bright green clarity. Objects usually glow slightly in that spectrum. Even shadows have gradation. What I saw had none. It was pitch black, like a hole cut into the image. Fatigue can cause misinterpretation. Staring through NVGs for extended periods can create afterimages and distortions. Your brain tries to fill gaps. You see patterns where there might be none. But the head peeking back out, that part stays with me. It wasn't a flicker, it wasn't a passing blur. It held position for several seconds. I've told this story only a handful of times. Not because I'm afraid of how it sounds, but because Afghanistan was already surreal enough without adding mystery to it. There were enough real threats, enough real firefights, enough real loss. Still, that night stands apart. Sitting on the flatbed, stars blazing above a silent, abandoned city. Watching through green-lit glass at a building that had probably housed families once. Seeing something move in a place that was supposed to be empty. There's something about operating in a war zone that makes the line between the physical and the psychological thin. You're hyper-aware of movement. You're scanning constantly. Your brain is wired to detect threats instantly. Sometimes that wiring makes you see things differently, or maybe sometimes it lets you see something you otherwise wouldn't notice. Now Zad was full of stories. Marines who'd been there longer than I had talked about shadows in buildings, strange movement on thermal scopes, fleeting figures at the edge of vision. Most of it can be explained by environment and stress, wind-moving debris, animals slipping through ruins, visual artifacts and equipment, but once in a while something doesn't fit neatly into explanation. The Mk-19 tower gunner leveling that house ended the possibility of finding out. If there was someone hiding inside, they didn't survive that barrage. If there was nothing there, then we destroyed an empty structure because of movement seen in the dark. Either way, the balcony was gone. Afghanistan was, and probably still is, a place where reality feels stretched. Ancient landscapes mixed with modern warfare. Villages that had stood for generations turned into battlefields. Silence broken by sudden violence. That night remains one of the stranger moments of my deployment. Not the scariest, not the loudest, just strange. The image of that black void against a mud wall under night vision still comes back sometimes. A shape where no shape should have been, moving slowly, then faster than seemed possible. I kept watch many nights after that. The stars never disappointed. The town remained mostly still, and whatever I saw on that balcony never showed itself again. When my mother was about 26 years old, she decided to take a short trip to a small island not far from the mainland. It was meant to be something simple and relaxing. The island was close enough that people regularly traveled there by boat, but far enough that it felt like an escape. At that age, she was adventurous and excited to see new places. She boarded the ship expecting a pleasant ride across the water, and a few peaceful days away. The weather that day did not seem unusual at first. The sea can change quickly. But when the boat left the dock, everything felt manageable. Passengers were walking around, talking, taking photos, and enjoying the breeze. My mother remembers standing on deck for a while before deciding to head inside. At some point during the journey, she went to use the restroom. It was a small bathroom, like you would expect on a passenger boat. Tight space, metal fixtures, and a simple door with a standard lock. Nothing about it suggested danger. She closed the door, locked it, and thought nothing more of it. Then the ship hit a massive wave. It was not just a gentle lift or a bump. It was the kind of wave that can catch a vessel off guard, especially if it comes at the wrong angle. The boat suddenly pitched hard. Inside that tiny bathroom, she had nothing to brace herself against. In an instant, the floor seemed to disappear beneath her. The force of the wave threw her upward. She slammed into the ceiling with enough impact to flip her completely off her feet. When she came crashing back down, her foot twisted underneath her body in a way it never should have. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. She said it felt like lightning shooting through her leg. She looked down and saw something no one ever wants to see. Her foot was turned backward at an unnatural angle. The skin had torn. There was blood. The shock of seeing her own body like that almost felt worse than the initial pain. She screamed. In that small, enclosed space, The sound must have echoed loudly. She tried to stand, but the moment she put any pressure on her injured foot, the pain intensified. It was not just a sprain, it was clearly something severe. She reached for the door handle and tried to unlock it, so someone could help her. But when the ship had been thrown by the wave, the locking mechanism had broken. The door would not open. She turned the handle again and again, pushing and pulling with her hands, but it would not budge. Now she was trapped. The boat continued moving, and the sea was still rough. She was alone in that bathroom with a badly injured foot, bleeding, in shock, and unable to open the door. The fear started to sink in. It was not just about the pain anymore, it was the feeling of being stuck. She kept screaming for help. Eventually, crew members became aware that someone was locked inside. They knew she had gone in there before the wave hit, but it took time to understand what had happened. They tried from the outside to open the door, but the damaged lock held firm. Minutes felt like hours, and then those minutes actually turned into hours. For nearly 3 hours, she remained inside that small bathroom. The boat rocked as it continued its journey. She was in extreme pain. Every movement sent waves of agony up her leg. She had to sit on the floor because she could not stand properly. She remembers staring at her foot, trying not to panic, trying not to pass out. Imagine being in that position. You have just been thrown into a ceiling by the force of the ocean. You look down and see your foot twisted the wrong way, bleeding, and you cannot get out. You do not know how long it will take for someone to break the door open. You do not know if the injury will get worse. You are stuck listening to the sounds of the ship and the sea outside, completely helpless. Eventually, the crew managed to break down the door. When it finally gave way, she was still conscious but exhausted. They helped her out carefully. The sight of her injury confirmed how serious it was. Her foot was visibly displaced, and the skin damage made it even more alarming. At that point, the ship's crew faced a difficult decision. They were already heading toward the island. The plan was to reach the island first and get medical assistance there, or arrange for her to be airlifted if necessary. Turning around immediately was not considered the fastest option at that moment, so the ship continued toward its destination. Meanwhile, my mother remained in extreme pain. There was a medic on board, and he examined her injury as best he could given the conditions. He confirmed that her foot was dislocated and likely fractured. The swelling was increasing, and the bleeding had to be controlled. Before they arrived, the medic made the decision to reposition the foot. Without advanced hospital equipment, it was a painful and difficult procedure. He had to twist the foot back into its proper alignment to prevent further damage. Even with basic pain management, the process was incredibly painful. She later described it as one of the worst moments of her life. After what must have felt like an eternity, the ship finally reached the island. There was hope that medical staff there would be ready to treat her, or that a helicopter could transport her to a proper hospital. Instead, the island staff refused to handle the case, for reasons that were likely related to limited medical facilities or liability concerns. They sent the ship back to the mainland. That meant more time on the water, more waiting, more pain, so the boat turned around and headed back. Throughout that return trip, my mother had to endure the ongoing pain of a serious injury. Even though her foot had been repositioned, the damage was still significant. The swelling and shock made everything worse. She could not move comfortably. She could only wait. When they finally arrived back at the mainland, she was transported to a hospital where doctors confirmed the extent of the damage. The injury required surgery. Massive metal plates had to be inserted into her leg and foot to stabilize the bones and allow proper healing. The recovery was long. Physical therapy followed. There were weeks of limited mobility, pain management, and adjustment. For someone who had boarded that ship expecting a peaceful trip, the outcome was completely different. In the end, she healed. The metal plates remain as a reminder of that day. She can walk. She can live normally. But the memory of being flipped into a ceiling by the force of a wave, of looking down and seeing her foot turned backward, of sitting trapped in a locked bathroom for 3 hours waiting for someone to break the door down, never fully fades. When she tells the story, there is still a pause when she describes that moment of impact. It was sudden, it was violent, and it was terrifying. Most people board ships without thinking about the raw power of the ocean. That day, she experienced firsthand how quickly things can change. One wave was all it took to turn an ordinary trip into a medical emergency. It is hard to imagine the fear she must have felt during those hours. The physical pain alone would have been overwhelming, but the isolation inside that locked bathroom likely made it worse. The uncertainty, the waiting, the helplessness. Looking back, it feels almost unreal that she survived something so severe and came out the other side, able to walk again. Modern surgery and metal plates helped repair the damage, but the emotional memory of that day is something only she truly understands. Sometimes when she walks, you would never guess that inside her leg and foot are large pieces of metal holding everything together. You would never guess that a single wave once threw her into a ceiling and left her trapped in pain for hours. But every time she tells the story, you can see it in her expression. Not just the pain, but the shock of how fast life can change. 1 minute you are on a normal trip, the next you are staring at your own injured body, waiting for someone to break down a door and save you. I've worked in a nursing home long enough to know that it becomes its own kind of world. When you spend most of your days and nights inside the same building, surrounded by the same residents, routines, and quiet hallways, you start to feel like time moves differently there. Birthdays, holidays, seasons, they all pass. But inside those walls, life runs on medication schedules, meal times, and the steady hum of call lights. A few weeks ago, one of our residents passed away. I'll call her Judy. She had lived at the facility for quite a while, long enough that almost everyone on staff knew her well. Judy was the kind of resident who made your shift better just by being there. She was friendly without being demanding. She remembered your name. She'd ask about your family. If you were having a rough night, she'd notice. She wasn't loud or dramatic, just kind, the kind of person who makes a place feel warmer. When she passed, it hit a lot of us harder than we expected. In nursing homes, death is something you learn to handle professionally. It's part of the job, but that doesn't mean it's easy. You still feel the absence when someone's room goes quiet. You notice when the TV that used to play game shows all afternoon is silent. You notice when the hallway seems a little emptier. Her room was cleaned out after her family collected her belongings. Maintenance repainted the walls. The bed was made up fresh. Within a short time, a new resident moved in. I'll call him Bob. Bob had just arrived at the facility not long after Judy died. He had no connection to her. He didn't overlap with her. He wasn't from the same town. As far as we knew, he had never heard her name. He was adjusting to the home like most new residents do, confused sometimes, quiet, still learning faces and routines. The room he moved into happened to be Judy's old room. At first, there was nothing unusual. Bob seemed fine. He kept to himself mostly, ate meals, responded to care, nothing out of the ordinary. The staff who had worked there longer knew the room's history, but the newer CNAs didn't. For them, it was just another room on the hall. Then, one afternoon, Bob's call light went on. If you've never worked in a nursing home, call lights are constant. Residents use them for everything: pain, bathroom assistance, questions, loneliness. You respond automatically when you see one lit up on the board. That day, 3 CNAs went down the hall together to answer Bob's light. Two of them had started after Judy had already passed. They never met her. They walked into his room and asked the standard question, "What do you need?" Bob looked confused. He said he didn't need anything. They told him his call light was on. He insisted he hadn't pressed it. That's not unusual by itself. Residents sometimes hit the button accidentally. Sometimes they forget they pressed it. So they asked again, gently, "Are you sure?" "Your light was on." That's when Bob said something that made them pause. He told them it wasn't him. He said Judy had turned it on. The CNAs exchanged looks. The two newer ones had no idea who Judy was. They assumed maybe it was a relative or someone Bob knew. They asked him who Judy was. He said she was the lady who stayed in his room. He said she was there, not in a joking tone, not dramatic, just matter of fact. The room went quiet. The two newer CNAs didn't know Judy had ever lived there. They didn't know her name. They had no reason to connect that room with any specific past resident. The third CNA, who had known Judy, felt her stomach drop a little. They asked Bob how he knew that name. He didn't really elaborate. He just repeated that Judy was there and that she had turned the light on. The call light had definitely been activated. It wasn't a system glitch. It had been manually pressed. After a few more questions, Bob seemed to settle down. He didn't appear frightened. He didn't seem distressed. He wasn't yelling or acting confused in a dramatic way. He simply believed what he had said. The story spread through the staff pretty quickly. In a place like that, things travel fast, especially things that are hard to explain. What made it stranger was that Bob had truly never met Judy. His admission paperwork showed he arrived after her passing. There had been no overlap. The new CNAs confirmed they had never mentioned Judy around him. In fact, they didn't even know who she was until that moment. Now, nursing homes come with their own atmosphere. You have residents with dementia, residents with vivid imaginations, residents who talk about people who aren't there. It's not uncommon for someone to mention a child standing in the corner or a spouse who passed years ago. Staff learn to gently redirect and not escalate those moments. But this felt different because of the name. It wasn't vague, it wasn't a lady, it was Judy. An old man who had no documented connection to her somehow used her name and connected it to that specific room. Since that day, there haven't been dramatic follow-ups. No objects flying, no doors slamming, no repeated call lights turning on by themselves. Bob hasn't seemed frightened. If anything, he appears calm in that room. Some of the staff joke that if the place is haunted, at least it's by someone kind. Judy really was nice. If she were lingering around, no one imagines her causing harm. Working in long-term care changes how you think about life and death. You see people at the end of their stories. You sit with them in their final days. You watch families say goodbye. The building becomes a container for a lot of emotion. Grief, relief, fear, love, all of it collects over time. Now, some people believe that energy stays in places like that. Others believe there's always a rational explanation. Maybe Bob overheard the name somewhere. Maybe a staff member mentioned Judy in passing. Maybe he misheard something and his mind filled in the rest. Maybe he pressed the button without remembering. All of those possibilities exist, but it's hard to ignore how specific it was. In the days after, I found myself walking past that room a little more aware of it. Not scared exactly, just curious. The hallway outside is the same as it's always been. The overhead lights hum softly. The scent of disinfectant lingers faintly in the air. The routine continues unchanged. Sometimes I wonder if Judy would even recognize the room now. The paint is slightly different. The furniture arrangement shifted. New family photos sit on the dresser where hers once were. If there is something unexplained about that place, it doesn't feel heavy or dark. It feels gentle. Maybe that's just comfort talking. When you lose residents you've grown attached to, part of you doesn't want them to vanish completely. You want to think that their presence lingers in some small way, that the kindness they brought doesn't just disappear. Bob hasn't mentioned Judy again in any dramatic way. No repeated sightings, no panic, just that one calm statement. She turned the light on. The call light itself is mounted low on the bed rail. It requires a firm push to activate. It doesn't trigger easily from accidental brushing. Maintenance checked it afterward. It worked fine. In a building where dozens of call lights go on and off daily, one unusual activation might not mean anything at all, but the name attached to it is what sticks. Staff still talk about it occasionally during slower shifts. Not in a frightened way, more in that half-curious, half-skeptical tone people use when they don't quite know what to make of something. I've worked enough night shifts to know that buildings settle, machines click, and imagination can run wild when you're tired. But this story didn't happen at 3 a.m. It happened during a normal part of the day, with 3 staff members present. Maybe it's coincidence, maybe it's memory, or maybe in a place where so many lives begin and end within the same walls, something lingers in ways we don't fully understand. If Judy is still around, I like to think she's just doing what she always did, making sure someone's taken care of. The event most people now call the Great Molasses Flood happened in January of 1919 in Boston, but for many it still feels unreal. When you first hear about it, it almost sounds like a strange joke from history. A flood of molasses. It sounds harmless, even ridiculous. Molasses is something you pour over pancakes or mix into baked goods. It is sweet, it is thick, it belongs in a kitchen, not in the streets. But that day proved how something that seems innocent can turn deadly in the worst possible way. At the time, a massive steel tank stood in the north end of Boston. It was about 50 feet tall and 90 feet wide, towering over the nearby buildings. Inside that tank were more than 2 million gallons of molasses. The molasses was stored there for industrial purposes. It was used to produce alcohol, which was needed for manufacturing explosives and other wartime supplies. The First World War had recently ended, but the demand for industrial alcohol was still high. The tank had been built quickly. Some reports later suggested that it had not been properly tested. Residents in the area had already complained that it groaned and leaked. Children sometimes collected the sticky drips that seeped from its seams. The structure did not inspire confidence, but it remained in place, filled to the top. On January 15, 1919, the weather in Boston was strangely warm for winter. A few days earlier, temperatures had been below freezing. Then suddenly, the air warmed significantly. That change may have increased pressure inside the tank. Molasses expands when it gets warmer, and fermentation inside the tank could also have created gas buildup. Around midday, the tank could not hold the pressure anymore. It burst. Witnesses described hearing a sound like a machine gun or a rumbling explosion. The steel walls tore apart, and a massive wave of molasses surged into the streets. It moved faster than anyone would expect something so thick to move. Some reports estimated the wave reached speeds of around 35 miles per hour. Imagine that for a moment. A wall of dark, heavy syrup racing down narrow city streets, crushing everything in its path. Buildings were knocked off their foundations. A nearby fire station was partially destroyed. Railroad tracks were twisted. Horses pulling wagons were lifted and thrown. People who were walking in the area had no warning. One moment they were going about their day, and the next they were hit by a wave of sticky, suffocating liquid. Molasses is not like water. You cannot swim in it easily. It resists movement. It clings to your clothes, your skin, your face. It is heavy and slow to release its grip. When the wave struck, people were knocked down and pinned. Some were swept along and slammed into debris. Others were trapped under wreckage that quickly became coated in thick syrup. The true horror of the disaster was not just the initial impact. It was what came after. As the molasses settled, it hardened slightly in the cooling air. The temperature began to drop again later that day, making the liquid even thicker. People who were caught in it found themselves unable to move. Those who were buried beneath it faced a terrifying reality. Every time they tried to breathe out, the thick substance pushed back in around them. Their movements only made it worse, because struggling in something so dense uses enormous energy. The more you fight, the faster you tire. And unlike water, molasses does not flow away easily once it surrounds you. It holds you in place. For some victims, the danger was immediate trauma from debris. For others, it was suffocation. Imagine trying to lift your arms in something that feels like wet cement. Imagine trying to shout for help while your mouth fills with something thick and sticky. You cannot dig yourself out. You cannot kick your legs freely. You are stuck in place, waiting for rescue that may or may not arrive in time. Even those who were not fully buried were still trapped. Rescuers rushed to the scene as quickly as they could. Police officers, firefighters, and ordinary citizens tried to pull people out. But stepping into the molasses was risky. It reached up to waist level in some areas. It sucked at boots and shoes. Some rescuers nearly became stuck themselves. Horses that had been caught in the flood struggled helplessly. Some had to be put down because they could not be freed. The smell of molasses mixed with destruction filled the air. It must have felt surreal. Instead of water flooding the streets, it was something sweet and brown, something that did not belong there. 21 people died as a result of the disaster. Many others were injured. Some suffered broken bones from being thrown by the wave. Others suffered crushing injuries. The youngest victim was just a child. Families were left in shock. The North End, a neighborhood filled with working-class immigrants, especially Italian families, was deeply affected. What makes the event so disturbing even today is the way molasses behaves. In water, you can float, you can swim. Even if you are caught in a current, there is at least some chance to move your limbs and push towards safety. In molasses, that is not the case. The density makes movement exhausting and slow. It pulls at you. It holds you. If you are not buried completely, you still face another danger. You cannot easily free yourself. You cannot simply walk out. Your legs sink, and every step feels like dragging hundreds of pounds. Rescuers cannot rush in quickly because they risk becoming trapped as well. So you wait. The thought of waiting like that is what makes many people uneasy when they learn about the flood. You are stuck. You are aware. You are surrounded by something that looks harmless but behaves like a trap. You cannot breathe properly. You cannot get out fast. You can only hope someone reaches you before it is too late. After the wave passed, cleanup was a massive challenge. The city brought in firefighters and workers who used salt water to try to wash the molasses away. It clung to everything: buildings, streets, tools, clothing. For weeks, the area remained sticky. People said that even years later, on hot summer days, you could still smell molasses in the neighborhood. The disaster led to one of the first major class action lawsuits in American history. Residents sued the company responsible for the tank, claiming it had been poorly built and improperly maintained. After years of legal battles, the company was found responsible and had to pay damages to victims and families. The flood also led to stronger building regulations. It showed what can happen when industrial structures are built without proper oversight. Safety standards improved partly because of tragedies like this. It was a painful lesson learned at a high cost. For many people today, the idea of a molasses flood taps into a very specific fear. It is not the fear of drowning in water. It is the fear of being trapped in something thick and unyielding, the fear of slow compression, the fear of knowing you cannot fight your way free. Unlike dramatic disasters with fire or explosions, this one was strangely quiet after the initial burst. Once the wave settled, it was just heavy stillness, thick syrup covering streets, people stuck where they had fallen. The horror was not loud. It was heavy and suffocating. When you imagine being caught in it, the mind focuses on the physical sensation. Your legs refusing to move, your chest tightening as the substance presses in, every breath becoming harder than the last. The instinct to struggle fighting against the reality that struggling only exhausts you. And if you manage to keep your head above it, you are still not safe. You are immobilized. You cannot reach solid ground. You must rely entirely on others to pull you free. Meanwhile, the cold air thickens the molasses around you. Time stretches. Minutes feel like hours. That is why the Great Molasses Flood continues to disturb people more than a century later. It was unexpected, it was preventable, and it was slow in a way that makes it psychologically terrifying. Today, there is a small marker in Boston that commemorates the event. Most tourists walk past it without realizing how catastrophic that day truly was. It is easy to dismiss the story because it sounds unusual, but for the families who lost loved ones and for those who were trapped in that heavy, suffocating wave, it was anything but strange. It was real, it was violent, and it changed the neighborhood forever. Even now, when people hear about it for the first time, they often react with disbelief. But once they picture the reality of being stuck in something you cannot swim in, cannot dig through, and cannot escape quickly, the fear becomes understandable. The Molasses Flood was not just a historical oddity. It was a reminder that danger does not always look dangerous. Sometimes it looks sweet, sometimes it moves slowly, but when it traps you, it can be just as deadly as any storm or fire. And that is what makes it linger in the imagination long after the last of the molasses was washed from the streets. I want to tell this carefully, because even now, when I think back on it, part of me questions how much of it was perception and how much of it was fear layered on top of a powerful experience. It was my first time taking mushrooms. I didn't ease into it. I took about 3/4 of an eighth, which for someone with no prior experience was probably more than I should have. At the time, I didn't fully understand how strong the effects could be, especially when you're new to psychedelics. We were in a familiar room, a place I had been in many times before. Same walls, same paint color, same group of friends. It was supposed to be a relaxed night, no chaos, just a few people hanging out, talking, waiting for the effects to come on. At first, it was subtle. Colors seemed warmer, edges looked softer. The room felt slightly alive. Like it was breathing. I remember laughing more than usual. My thoughts felt stretched out but still connected. It was manageable. Then things started to shift in a way I wasn't prepared for. It felt like I kept blacking out in small bursts, not like falling asleep, but like losing a few seconds of continuity. One moment I'd be following a conversation, the next I'd feel like I had skipped ahead in time. I would come to and things would feel slightly different, like I had stepped into the same room but at a slightly different angle in reality. The first time I noticed something was off in a deeper way, it was the paint. I swear the color of the room changed. It wasn't dramatic, like bright red turning neon green. It was more subtle, like the tone shifted. The shade didn't match the version of the room I remembered walking into earlier that night. It looked like a different hue entirely. At first, I assumed it was just the lighting warping under the mushrooms. Psychedelics are known for altering color perception. That part, rationally, makes sense. But then I looked at the people. There were faces I recognized, but something about them felt different. Their posture, their energy, even the way they were talking. And in between these blackouts, it felt like the group composition changed. I remember blinking and suddenly feeling like someone was there who hadn't been there before. The conversations were what really unsettled me. They were talking about shared memories, about events involving me and them. But some of those stories didn't line up with my memory. They were referencing things I knew, but the details were slightly off. It felt like they were describing alternate versions of moments from my life. As I sat there listening, I had this creeping sense that I wasn't in the same version of events I had started in. And then it got worse. I heard myself speak, not in the way you normally participate in conversation. It felt like my body was talking without me fully deciding what to say. Words were coming out of my mouth about memories I didn't consciously remember. I was responding naturally, laughing, nodding, contributing, but inside, I felt like I was trapped behind my eyes. It's hard to explain unless you've experienced something like dissociation. It felt like I was sitting a few inches back from my own face, watching my body operate. I wasn't controlling it in the way I was used to. It felt automatic, detached. That was the moment the fear hit. Until then, it had been strange, but manageable. When I realized I felt separated from my own will, that's when panic started creeping in. I had this overwhelming thought, I've switched realities. It sounds dramatic now, but in that moment, it felt real. It felt like I had somehow slipped into a parallel version of my life. A place where the room was slightly different, where my friends had slightly different histories, where my own memories didn't fully match the environment I was in. And the worst part wasn't the strangeness. It was the loneliness. The thought that I had accidentally left my original reality and might never get back. That I would be stuck in this almost familiar world forever, knowing it wasn't quite right. That the people around me weren't exactly the same people I knew. It felt isolating in a way I've never experienced before or since. My heart was racing. I wanted to ask someone if they noticed something was off, but I was afraid of sounding completely unhinged. So I stayed quiet, trapped behind my own face, watching myself participate in conversations I didn't feel fully present in. The blackouts continued in waves. Each time I came back, something felt slightly adjusted, like tuning a radio dial and landing close to the right station but not perfectly aligned. Over time, as the peak of the mushrooms passed, things started settling. The room's color began looking more like I remembered. The faces felt more consistent. The energy shifted back towards something recognizable. The dissociation eased slowly. I started feeling more in control of my speech. My thoughts felt more directly connected to my actions again. By the time the effects wore off, everything looked normal. Everyone who had started the night with me was there. No new faces, no strange replacements. The paint was the same as always. The conversations, when I tried to recall them sober, lined up more logically. No one remembered discussing alternate versions of events. On paper, the explanation is simple. Psychedelics can heavily distort perception. They can amplify derealization and depersonalization. They can alter memory processing in real time. They can create the intense illusion that reality itself is shifting. From a neurological standpoint, what likely happened was that the mushrooms disrupted the brain networks, responsible for maintaining a stable sense of self and continuity. When that continuity falters, it can feel like reality itself is unstable. But here's the part that still lingers. Even though everything looked normal afterward, a small part of me has this quiet, irrational thought that maybe I didn't fully return to where I started. It's not something I actively believe on a daily basis. I function normally. Life continues, but occasionally, when something feels slightly off or when a memory doesn't line up perfectly, that night echoes in the back of my mind. What if I came back, almost to the same place, but not entirely? That thought is what scares me most. Not the visuals, not the dissociation, but the idea that reality might not be as fixed as it feels. Logically, I know that's the after effect of a very intense first psychedelic experience. The brain is incredibly powerful at constructing reality. When that construction is temporarily altered, it can leave a psychological imprint long after the chemical effects fade. What I experienced has a name in psychology: derealization and depersonalization. It's that sensation of being detached from yourself or your surroundings. Under the influence of psilocybin, it can become extreme. The brain regions that anchor identity and continuity can temporarily loosen their grip. But when you're inside it, it doesn't feel like brain chemistry. It feels cosmic. It feels like you've slipped sideways into something unknowable. Looking back now, I don't think I shifted realities. I think my perception fractured under a dose I wasn't prepared for. My mind filled in the gaps with a narrative that made sense in the moment. Still, that experience changed how I think about consciousness. It showed me how thin the line can be between feeling grounded and feeling completely unmoored. It showed me how quickly your sense of control can dissolve. And it taught me a deep respect for how powerful psychedelics can be, especially the first time. I haven't had an experience quite like that since, but I've never forgotten what it felt like to sit in a room that looked almost like mine, surrounded by people who were almost like my friends, speaking in a voice that sounded like mine, and feeling utterly alone behind my own eyes. Even now, when everything feels stable and familiar, there's a tiny whisper in the back of my mind that asks, "What if?" I don't let that thought run my life, but I remember it. If you're still here, it means these stories didn't just pass through you, they stayed. Every story you heard was real. Real people, real moments, and in every one of them, something went wrong, or almost did. No ads interrupted that, because you asked, and I listened. But keeping this alive takes more than most people realize. Your support, however small, is what keeps the darkness going. Link in description, bio, and first comment. There are more stories waiting, and not all of them end before it's too late. Subscribe to Shadow Archives, and if this meant something to you, you already know what to do.